Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would really like to formally invite the host of the evening, Framji Minwala, and the authoress Uzma Aslam Khan Sahab to come to the stage. Framji, I'm very tempted to read out the entire qualification. It's so long and it's so large. Media and ICS, media and film, visual, queer, literary or otherwise. His essays and reviews have appeared in numerous journals and anthologies. He was assistant editor for Harper Business. He is currently with the Zebist media, film and all forms. DFA in Dramatology and Dramatic Criticism, Wales Drama School, has taught at Dartmouth College, Professor, Department of Theatre, the George Washington University, Assistant Professor, Department of Theatre and Department of English, NYU, Visiting Assistant Professor, Tisch College of Arts, Fordham, Adjunct Assistant Professor, Department of Theatre is Visual and at Zebis, Professor, Head of Department, Faculty of Media, IBA. Framji Minwala, we welcome you, and you will introduce the author and we'll have the session. All the best.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the book launch for The Miraculous True History of Nomi Ali. If you have not bought this book, if you have not read this book, I urge you to go to Liberty Books right there and pick up a copy. It's an excellent, excellent, beautiful novel. Uzma Aslam Khan, I'm sure, needs no introduction to regular attendees of the festival. She's the author of 4 previous novels translated worldwide to critical acclaim. These include Trespassing, nominated for a Commonwealth Prize, The Geometry of God, a Kirkus Review Best Books of 2009, and the winner of the Bronze Award at the Independent Publisher Book Awards. Thinner Than Skin, which is longlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize and the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature, and it won the French Embassy Karachi Literature Festival Best Fiction Award in 2014. Her work has appeared in Granta, the Massachusetts Review, The Guardian, Counterpunch, Dawn, Herald, among other anthologies and journals, national and international. Uzma was born and raised in Pakistan, has lived in many locations across the globe, including England, Japan, the Philippines, and Oceania. She currently resides in the United States. You can visit her on our webpage at uzmaaslamkhan.blogspot.com, and I urge you to do if you'd like to read reviews of her books, her upcoming events, readings, etc. They're all listed on in that blogspot, yes? Uzma, I think you're going to introduce how the book germinated, how it emerged, and then you're going to read a little bit of it, I think?
Right.
Okay. So.
Thank you, Framji, and thank you all for being here. I thought I would tell you a little bit about the story to this story, because the story is itself quite a fascinating one. So before I read to you from the book, a little bit of an introduction. It began with an accident over 26 years ago. So the book has been about 27 years in the making. That's more than half my life. So this book grew me up. I don't feel like I grew any of the characters up. They grew me up. So it began with me going to the library to find a book for some other project that I was working on. And by accident, I pulled another book off the shelf. And I found a quote by a British official from the 1930s. His name was Sir Henry Craik. And the quote, which I will tell you, is, "The amenities and conditions of life and health of the terrorist prisoners in the penal colony are superior to those obtaining in the Indian jails. The punishment is not imprisonment, but only banishment from home. It is a prisoner paradise." So this really fascinated me, and I looked up what he meant by the prisoner paradise and the penal colony, and I discovered that it was the Andaman Islands. Now, many of you have heard of Kalapani, I think, just like we all have. We grew up hearing of Kalapani, but we don't really know much more. We know of it as some kind of place of vague horror that happened somewhere, in the Black Waters, but we don't know where. So I started looking up information on the Andaman Islands, and I discovered that, Indian prisoners, political prisoners, terrorists, what they were called at the time, still called, were being sent there since the 1800s. And I also discovered that women prisoners were being sent there. And fascinatingly, though not unsurprisingly, British and South Asian historians had completely eliminated any mention of a single woman prisoner's name or story. So we got this general idea that women were being sent there too, but we never got anything more than that. So I was sort of astonished by this, and most of all, I think I was moved by my own ignorance. The question that I was asking myself is, why don't I know about this? And I think that has been true with a lot of my books. Like, they begin with a question, and the question is often to do with a rebellion against my own ignorance. So why wasn't I told this? Why don't I know? Why was this hidden from me? Why don't I know about my history? And the other thing I discovered was not only was it a British penal colony, but during the Second World War, the Japanese occupied these islands. So it was a double occupation. And this double occupation also really interested me, and the question of why we know so much about Japanese horrors, but know so little about British horrors. I went to a convent school. The syllabus came from Cambridge University. Of course, Cambridge University wasn't going to tell us about what the British did. So I, again, was confronted with my own lack of information, and there was this rebellion fermenting against my own ignorance and against my education and against the media and against those who write our history. So with that in mind, I started writing this book, just a tiny, tiny scrap of paper where the first character I wrote was a woman prisoner. And because history had erased her, it felt wrong to give her a name. So she was the unnamed prisoner. And over time, I gave her a number, because this is true that prisoners were given, they wore a wooden tag with a name, with a number on it. And the number I gave her was 218D, D for dangerous, which is what was on the tag. And 218 because I was born on 219. So I felt that she was born a day before me. And so that's how the number came about. And so that's just a little bit about how I started writing. Because this book began with the prisoner, and because she was actually the first fictional character that I ever wrote, because this was my very first book. As some of you may know, I have 4 other books, as Framji just said. She was the very, very first character that I wrote. So I feel that I owe it to her to read you a segment from her section. The title of the book is The Miraculous True History of Nomi Ali. So Nomi is the character that came later and who helped me finish the book. But the character who helped me begin was the prisoner. She is actually the miraculous in the title. So it's miraculous that I came upon the story of the islands, and it's miraculous that I finished the book after 27 years, because I really didn't think I would ever finish the book. So I'll read you now just a slight disclaimer. I'm going to read you from the second half of the novel. Normally I read from the beginning because it's sort of easier to set the plot and the setting and tell you a little bit about that. But I really want to read from later in the book, which means that I have to disclose something. And what I'm going to disclose is that the prisoner escapes. So she has gone from South Andaman Islands, which is where the prison was, to another island. And unknown to her, it is 1943. The Japanese have occupied South Andaman Islands. She doesn't know what month it is or what year it is. She also doesn't know that the British are trying to reoccupy the islands. So, with that said, a little bit from the book. She kept walking, besieged by the question she had heard more than any other. Why did you do it? And she wondered, as always, why they kept asking for one answer when they knew, as well as she did, that freedom was made of many parts. Someone outside a door she had delivered a parcel to once put it best. Wear and tear, that is their weapon, wear and tear. A million answers lay buried in the deep pockets of wear and tear. But if they insisted on only one answer, it was this. She did not do what she did to avenge her father's murder or to avenge her friend Kajal's murder. The people who explained her actions thus wished to confuse justice with revenge, to avoid turning the question on themselves. She did what she did to turn the question on them. Why did they do it? Steal a land and its people, rape and torture them, ship them to alien shores and confine them within their own? The bullet that killed her father was but one. The bullet that killed Kajal, but another. She was not merely carrying one or two. She was carrying them all. The greatest violence was the silence that accompanied each one. All they had to do was stop trying so hard to forget. Were they to try, even a little, she might speak to them because it had been a long, long time since she spoke and she was waking. Those words she ought to have written in Calcutta before she was transported, when paper and pencil were given to her for the last time, they were surfacing. Somewhere in the great sky, beyond this sky of plains, was a star made entirely of words. And on the star lived as many different kinds of words as birds in all the skies, fish in all the seas, and clay patterns in all the hands of adoring women. Some words were cautious as the crabs nesting on the beach, others bold as the giant hornbills prattling in the trees. Then there were those words that made no sound but were equally fearless, folding their arms and waiting for her to sit on their lap. The prisoner, who was now no longer a prisoner, was gathering all these many words to herself and would speak them if there were but someone to listen, even a little. As there was no one, she was left to contemplate the last word she had been given. War. The one happening in the sky was not the sort she had seen before, and these bombs were like nothing from a Lahore factory. How the sea raged beneath the sparest of words. War. In every other language known to her, the word was given more letters, or at least more syllables. Jung, Yudha, Harab, and now, in the language of the islanders, Kugebe. Yet in English, there was no tongue or teeth to it. War could be whispered with lips closed. She pushed on towards a part of the island normally avoided. The trees here were so dense that they looped around each other and came out the other side of love with arms raised as if they had been caught. Hardly any sunlight slinked through their tight knots, and as she moved forward, day turned to night. Her last time here, she had witnessed a sight that must have astonished even God. A man was hacking at one of the trees, forcing a path through its roots. He hopped aside just in time to escape the thorn-spread vine that came swinging in his direction from someone's idea of heaven. Each thorn was the size of a small knife. She had wanted to ask, revenge or justice? Now she paused by the knots that obliterated the sky. She did not know why she went this way. Something compelled her. A baby boar came out of the darkness, skipping daintily aside when it saw her. The grass was high and leeches covered her bare legs. She started to hear the river and moved toward its source. Red and yellow parakeets swooped along the roof of the forest, wearing a crow-like bird with a yellow bill and a very long tail. At the tail's tip was a knob the shape of a badminton racket, and she wondered how it flew, dragging that weight around. She used to play badminton with Faris, her neighbor, and when he was alive, with her father, who told her that the rules of badminton were determined in Karachi by the British. It was the sort of thing he would know. They played without a net, and so the shuttlecock, like the bird with the racket tail, flew low to the ground. As the rush of the river grew louder, she cut right. There was an incline with 4 boulders arranged like steps. They were polished with moss, and as she slipped, sunlight glanced her cheek. She cut right again towards the light. She stopped abruptly. 4 men, 2 English and 2 Indian, were pulling 2 small boats out of the river. "Is this the place?" one of them asked, and an Indian replied, "Yes, Mr. Andrew." The men hauled their boats ashore and started to unload their packs. They wore dark green shirts and carried fish nets and Sten guns. Andrew alone carried a gun and a rifle. After concealing the boats, still without noticing her, the men trekked deeper into the forest. She followed them. The man closest to her, who made up the rear, the way he tilted his head to the side made her suspect that he sensed something. But her footsteps were light. It was the 4 men in boots who snapped twigs and rustled palms and caused a flock of birds with badminton rackets to go, badminton racket tails to caw, caw, caw. A murder of crows, her teacher in Lahore had once told the class. Miss Flora Sparks, who taught the girls to speak with mouths closed and caned the ones who would not kneel. Caw, caw, caw. The men advanced slowly. It grew darker and they carried no torches. They were slow outlines between swinging vines. Even their whispers had ceased. Her arms and legs were badly scratched, but it did not occur to her to stop or to wonder how she would find her way back. At last, one man said, "Here." They dropped their packs. She sat on her haunches, aware that the last time she saw a white man was in jail. When a ration of food was distributed, she sniffed. She had eaten only meat, fruit, and insects for years. Now she smelled ghee and rice, real rice, not the kind that had fed her in jail. There was also a vegetable that she could not say which one, though, followed by a sweet smell. Chocolate. Yes, she was sure of it, chocolate. She shut her eyes and listened to the wrappers, that crisp, clean sound. Her mouth filled with saliva, her heart hammered. She was still poised on her haunches when she heard the men snore. She had to pee, and in her position it would be easy, but the scent might carry. She badly wanted that chocolate. There had to be more. When the pain in her bladder was severe, she forced herself upright. Her legs hurt. They had never entirely ceased aching since her transportation across the ocean. And as she moved toward the sleeping men, if twigs cracked, she did not care. She bent down to grab the chocolate, but before she could get it, an arm shot up and grabbed her arm. Before she could free herself, all the men were pointing Sten guns to her temple. I'll stop there. Thank you. The things we do for chocolate. So.
Uzma, could you talk a little bit about what it was like living with this novel for 26 years, which is how long it's taken you to write it?
Yeah, good question. So, you know, I've been asked, like, why did I stick with this book for so long? And I think the simple answer is just love. I mean, the more I was writing The Prisoner, the more her character was intriguing me, and the more I had to find out about these islands and what it was like for her to live on them, and the experience of those who were transported. So that's, first it's just this fierce love, this need to sort of follow through with what I had begun. It was also a little bit of worry or fear that if I did not, now that I knew about, you know, that women were transported and that people were transported and their stories had been erased, now that I knew that these stories were deliberately erased from our history, if I also erased her story, then I would also be complicit in this erasure. So it was love as well as defiance, as well as a need to not be complicit, as well as a need to assert my right to another history, a history that is my right to tell, and not simply accept the history that had been handed down to me, mostly by white privilege. That there are many ways of knowing our history and exploring it, and there are many histories, and we have the right to create and recreate and reclaim the history that we know and tell and share. So.
one of the things that is clear when you read the novel is the amount of research that you did and the amount of research that went into the writing of it. Pardon me, my voice is a little sore because I have bad throat allergy, scratchy throat and allergies today. One of the things that really amazed me is how you have managed to integrate some of the the documents that you found, the actual letters that went back and forth, the cables, the edicts, the decisions that were made at different government levels that did not necessarily take into account the lives of these people who were in a sense stranded on these islands, literally stranded on these islands. Could you talk a little bit about what it was like to write the other novels and at the same time consistently come back to this? Because I hear echoes of this novel, I hear echoes of your other novels rather in this novel, that in a sense you were writing all that other work and at the same time this, in a sense, so that they were, it seems to me that they were informing each other, perhaps. Is that?
Yeah. No, that's also a great question, Framji. So yes, the research. I mentioned that it took so long. In part, one reason it took so long was that I kept getting stuck on factual details. I mean, all fiction writers take liberties with facts, right? I mean, we reinvent, we create, we honor the language of our art over the actual facts. But when you're writing about a real time and a real place, the question of accuracy does loom large. And when I first began, that question of accuracy intimidated me. I mean, I was very young, and I wanted to get it right. So that was one reason why I kept stopping. And one of the details that really kind of bothered me was, even though there were history books that sort of said men and women prisoners, and then I read actual accounts written by male prisoners that also said women prisoners without naming a single one, I wanted evidence in official language of a single woman who actually went there. So I got very stuck on this point. And, I'll tell you that I finally found that evidence in 2015. So I began in 1992. And then in 2015, I got a fellowship to go to the British Library and do some research there. And it happened, like all good stories, on the last day that I was looking through these archives, and I found an actual telegram between the British about the question of transporting women prisoners. And I have used those telegrams in my book, and I have used other correspondences between my book, in the book. So that is one way in which I was sort of integrating the factual history with the made-up parts. Like Nomi is a made-up character, the prisoner is a made-up character, but the foundation is real, that this could have happened if someone had bothered to take enough interest in telling us about these lives. But coming back to the second part of your question, my other books, I mean, one of the questions that started to interest me in all my books is this question of resistance. The people who write the history books have words for people who resist. So the British call them terrorists. Today they're still called terrorists. And who decides what they are called? Who decides who is a freedom fighter and who is a terrorist? Who decides, when it is justified, when violence is justified and when it isn't? Like, all my books have, I think, interrogated violence and power, and how we are surrounded by that violence, and at the same time, we never talk about it. And one reason why it keeps perpetrating and self-perpetuating is because we keep looking away, and we want to avoid certain questions of what desperation leads to. So, the question of resistance and how we resist, and whether men and women resist differently, which I think they do, and in all my books they have resisted differently, and what women who take up arms are called, because that's what this prisoner does, and how differently the narrative is framed when a woman is violent than from when a man is violent, and during the freedom movement, the women played a supporting role to male revolutionaries, but it was always sort of framed as them playing a supporting role. It was never about their freedom. And they were often, fighting on two levels. It was the freedom freedom from the British, as well as freedom from, what was happening at home. So it's always been two tiers. It's the big picture, and then it's the smaller picture, although I would debate whether it's smaller, which is what's happening within the home and between family members. And I think that is true for all my books, is this question of what freedom is and how we negotiate it, and how we frame the narrative around it, who gets to frame it, and what those who try to reclaim the right to frame it are called.
To come to the violence slightly circuitously, one of the things that you consistently work with in all your work, I've noticed, but especially here, and I think to greatest effect here, is perspective, and the way in which perspective changes the way we understand a particular context, a situation, an incident, a behavior, an act, a personality, a psychology, etc. And even in the very little passage that you read, the refrain, revenge or justice, is very much about perspective. It depends on how you look at the act and how you judge it, right?
Yeah.
Could you talk about how, as a writer, you inhabit those perspectives, even the most deplorable ones, perhaps, and how that perhaps how that serves as a frame for your thinking about fiction, or the writing of fiction?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, a fiction writer has to embody the character. It doesn't matter how much research we do. It doesn't matter how much we think we know. When we actually start writing, if we're not, in some ways, it's like acting, which you know a lot about. So, like theater guy next to me. I mean, you are performing, but not necessarily three-dimensionally. You're performing on the page. You are becoming the character. You have to think and feel like them, and then that sometimes means that you are justifying deplorable things, just like they would be. So you do have to go there, and that is challenging. And I think, when you do it, you're kind of in this trance-like state. Where you forget yourself, or you need to forget yourself, and sometimes it's harder to forget yourself, but sometimes it isn't. And there were characters that challenged me. So, I said that the prisoner is somebody I carried right from the beginning, and her character never changed very much. Like in 26 years, she stayed more or less who she was. But there were other characters. For instance, there's a character, Shakuntala, who changed a lot. She's unrecognizable now. Why did one change and not the other? I don't know, but I often use the metaphor of driving, where you start off when you're writing fiction, you're driving the car, you think you're in control, and your characters are in the passenger seat, but actually they're the ones driving and you're in the passenger seat, and you're the one being carried, and they're telling you where you need to go. And what's interesting to me also is that the two Japanese characters in my book, I lived in Tokyo when I was a child, and I lived in London when I was a child. And I don't know if I was channeling some of that, but the two Japanese characters that I wrote, both of whom do deplorable deeds, they came to me effortlessly. I hardly had to revise those sections. And I'm not really sure if that's a good thing. When by the time you're done putting yourself in them, it's fairly exhausting emotionally and mentally. I always feel really drained after I'm done with a book. So yeah.
But even so, the children's voices seem to ethically center the novel.
Yeah.
That it is that the vision we see through Nomi's eyes, through Z's eyes, through Aya's eyes, in a sense, is an ethical ground around which we measure the ethics or the morals of other acts committed by other characters in the novel.
Yeah.
I think this is also true in a sense in the Geometry of God, where the children's voices seem to have a clarity that the other voices don't.
Yeah.
Is there something about a child's voice that you're drawn to that you find is effective?
I think it's it's very tender, right? I mean, childhood is very tender, and the impressions that are left on us as children are often the most deep ones and the ones that we carry. So yeah, I'm also very interested in this question of those who are caught between powers. So children are caught between powers, not just empires, the Japanese and the British, but they're also caught between parents, and they're caught between other relatives, and they're constantly absorbing. They're absorbing information, they're absorbing feelings, they're absorbing opinions, and they're being shaped often by horrendous events, and they don't know it. So this question of what we internalize unconsciously, what we carry, what we hold, without actually knowing what it is, without any language with which to articulate what it is, I find that very, very poignant, because the language then has to form around all of this. And ultimately you have to find your own language. So the challenge for me as a writer is finding that language. Every time I write a book, I have to start with a new language. And I said earlier, one of the things that kept sort of holding me up and preventing me from finishing the book was the factual details, but the bigger one was the language. And I just knew that there were some characters that I didn't have their language yet. The texture, the feeling, there was something that wasn't there yet. And it's actually when I found NOMI that I found the language. And which is why I say that NOMI helped me to complete the book, and why I gave her the title. Because it is that child's perspective, the child's innocence, as well as savvy, as well as survival skills, and her sensitivity, and her capacity often to see what the adults are not seeing. Like when I realized that that's the perspective, then my road also became a little easier.
It's also interesting that the child then, or a child's, in a sense, formative experiences is informed by and conditioned by the perspectives of other characters.
That's
and
right.
Depending on where a child might find herself or himself most safe, perhaps.
That's right.
Is the perspective that the child will then tend to adopt, at least in the context of the novel.
That's right.
And so part of the way in which you play with perspective, I think, is also crucial to the kind of coming of age story that we also have here, of Nomi's coming of age, or in fact her growing up, and the way in which other people's perspectives shape her own perspectives, and whether she ultimately is able to break out, or I'm not going to spoil the novel for people, but whether she's able to actually forge a way of thinking through the events that have happened to her, these horrendous things that have happened to her, which in a sense would drive the most sane person completely bananas. I mean, put you in a loony bin. I would imagine that anybody who went through what these characters have gone through would end up in a loony bin. At the same time, humans are remarkably resilient and resistant to the violence that happens to them. So is that one of the things that it's one of the things I take from the novel, is the resistance that is also a kind of resilience, right? The human resilience.
Yeah.
What would you like an audience or readers to think about, get from reading this historical novel about a part of our history that very few of us actually know, in terms of just the unrelenting violence of it? I mean, one of the things, you don't actually shy away from violence, which is really one of the wonderful ways in which this novel works, is that you're unflinching about the descriptive parts, the violent parts of the novel, in your description of the violent parts of the novel, right? To talk a little bit about how that figured into your thinking about what a reader might take away from it, or what a reader might understand about his or her own history, our history, collective history.
I mean, I like that you have brought up the question of resilience, because I mean, one of the things that I said is that what's common in all my books is resistance. But yes, resistance and resilience go together, and I do feel that these characters are, they are able to negotiate, some of them, a path. Some of them are not, some of them are. And I feel that, when a body is written out of history, which is what has been done with this period in our history, all these, brown bodies, black bodies have been written out of our history. They're nowhere. They've just been erased. It's as if this didn't happen. When there is this complete erasure, the only way to bring them back, the only way to heal is to put your own body there with empathy and with love and compassion. And so I don't feel that we can come to terms with this violence that happened and that is still happening. So for me, this is not just a book about the past, it's very much a book about the present. That is still happening. We can't really come to terms with this violence till we look at it. And that's where the resilience comes in. Like, if Nomi had not have to look at it, then her story would have been completely different. These characters have had to go through a certain journey in order to come out. And some of them do and some of them don't, and I don't want to give away the stories, but I just feel that avoidance is not a way forward, and avoidance is where we always get stuck. And it's very important to me to look unflinchingly at what we're not supposed to look at. Yeah.
It's important, I think, that it's set in a space that is outside of the public eye, in the way that many of our contemporary prisons seem to be. Guantanamo in the U.S., Alcatraz in the U.S., Siberia in the Soviet Union, the Andaman Islands is a place, Botany Bay and the original penal colony in Australia, that in a sense, the world of the prison is seen as a kind of liminal space where you exit society and you go somewhere else where you are either reformed and then brought back into the social world, or you are left to while out the rest of your days, to live out the rest of your days in misery and terror in that liminal space where you will not harm society, right? It also seems like the space in which children go, the liminal space, to grow up in the conventional sort of literary. Were you thinking of those things deliberately, or was that a happy coincidence?
I feel like a lot of these, the difficult thing about talking about your own writing is that you talk about it months, even years later, right? And so there's a distance between the writer who is speaking and appearing in front of you now and the writer who was writing and who was trying to figure out what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it. There's this huge gap. And I think that with art, most of it is unconscious. It's not done with the head, it's done with a different part of the body. Like, I teach, and I often ask my students, with which part of your body do you write? And sometimes I say with my big toe, sometimes with my knee, sometimes with my, I don't really know. So all of this, what you're saying, it's the analysis, but the writing is not analytical. The writing is really an act of faith, it's unconscious. But probably there was a part of me that was very intrigued by the Andaman Islands as a liminal space. Between the British and the Japanese, between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and then as prison colonies as in-between spaces, childhood as in-between spaces. I feel like that's also the space that I inhabit, So maybe because I never grew up, so that's another story. But it's just, I am very fascinated, again, by people who are caught in between and what that middle space, what it offers. Is there light there? Is there only shadow? Like, how can you see light there? How do you articulate what that space is? I am very interested. I think there's a quote in Thinner Than Skin that talks about the middle space and how, I'm always intrigued by like horizontal spaces, like going sideways rather than going vertical. History is written vertically, it's hierarchical. It is people with power who write it. And for me, I am not, on that tower. I belong on the floor. I am, small brown Muslim woman from the global south. Like, who would believe that I could write this? So I inhabit this other space where I go on the floor and I go horizontally and I create other spaces from which to write this book. I could not have written it if I was somewhere in the vertical.
I think one of the really interesting things that you do in your work, especially in this and in Thinner Than Skin, is that the liminal space for one person is actually home for somebody else. And that in some ways it's the clash of that individual entering the liminal space and disrupting the life of the person for whom that is a habitat that creates some of that sort of narrative tension, that sort of dramatic tension in the novel. And that was very much so here and very much so in Thinner Than Skin as well. We talked a little bit about this yesterday on the phone. In one of your interviews, you said that one of the things you were trying to explore was the incredible lack of empathy that the Japanese and the British had for the people who they imprisoned on these islands. Could you talk a little bit about empathy and empathy in the context of the novel, empathy in the context of fiction in general, and readers perhaps in relation to reading about the lives of the oppressed, the suppressed, the victimized, the murdered, the dead?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I have a French translator who translated 3 of my previous books, Thinner Than Skin, Geometry of God, and Trespassing, and she was very keen on reading this book. And when I sent it to her, she said, it surprised her, I'm not sure why. And then she said, these days people are so wrapped up in their own problems, why would anybody want to read this book? And I actually appreciated her honesty, because I feel like that's maybe a response that a lot of people would have, is why would anybody want to read about the lives of Indians, at the time they were called Burmese, living on this island that nobody cares about, nobody remembers, nobody has written about in fiction during this period. Why would they care? That question of why care, why bother to read about other people? I feel like that's exactly where fiction comes from. It comes from a need to write about those who are not being seen and not being heard. And I am always interested in the marginalized, the people who get that kind of response, the people who other people would say, why care? You and I both know that if these characters were all white, we would, the world would have bothered by now. So the racism that is entrenched in that kind of thinking is certainly something that I'm aware of when I'm writing and when I am centering these lives, when I am insisting that these lives do matter, that they count, and that they deserve not just a place in story, but a central place in story. And the only way to do that is to care. That's my short answer, but I could talk a lot more. But yeah, in this book, there are prisoners, there are children, it's also one thing I'd like to say is that it's interfaith. So there are, people of all religions living on this island, which is true. When the British sent Indians to this colony, they said it was to sever all connection to caste and creed. That's a direct quote. So it was a way of erasing history. And that erasure is the one thing that people on this island had in common with each other. So Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs and Christians and, if any Parsi had done anything wrong, they would have ended there, but no Parsi has ever done anything wrong, so they never went there. They all ended up there together. And the miraculous part is also that they found a harmony between each other. And I think that's really important to remember in this time and place, is that the enemy is not each other. The enemy came from elsewhere.
I think we have about 10 minutes. Can you open it up for questions from the audience? No questions?
Do we need a microphone?
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Here is Khadim Sen Sumro. What is your opinion about terrorism and patriotic movements in entire world?
So where is the question?
Could you repeat that, please?
And could you stand up,
Stand
please?
up.
I can't see.
I am here,
Could you wave?
just here.
Yeah, over there.
Oh, okay.
Here I am. What is your opinion about the patriotic movements and entire world like Catalan, like Quds, and other movements in the world, Palestine? I want you must define that. Are they terrorists or they are patriotic movements?
I think I understand the question. The question is, what is my opinion on nationalist movements? I personally don't feel that I can generalize and that I can make one statement about nationalist movements. I think we have to take them, in their own context and understand the context of the people living within and people living under oppression, and how organically these movements, whether we call them revolutions, whether we call them nationalist movements, whatever it may be, I feel that we have to take each one in its context. So, you mentioned 3 or 4 different ones, and each one is very, very different. For me, in this book, the British and the Japanese both used nationalism to oppress people on these islands. So this particular context is one that is not, nationalism, I'm not in favor of it in this context, and that's as much as I can say.
Another question?
There was a hand up there in the middle. Yeah.
But I think the mic is on.
Hello? Uzma?
Hello? Yeah.
Yeah, you said it was exhausting writing the book. It was very exhausting reading it.
Okay.
It was very hard to go through. We had it for our book club this month.
Okay. This
So-
morning?
No, this month. We
Okay.
already finished reading it. And I almost didn't read it. I was like, it was hitting me in the gut. So, but my friends were also saying this, oh, so sad and depressing, we're not going to. But I kept on, I plodded on, I kept on, and then I told all of them, you must read it right till the end, because the writer is really good and she's worked hard at it. So,
Thank you.
Very, very
I'm
good
glad.
work. I really admire your research and very hard work, and you say you lived with it 27 years. I just was wondering, where does the reality leave off and the fiction comes in? Can you just, I know the characters are fictional. 128, what was the number? 281?
218.
218,
Yeah.
and Nomi, they are fictional characters?
Yeah. Nomi is fictional, but her brother Z is based on an actual character.
Acha, okay, and matlab, how did you find out the torture, the extent of torture? This was like written somewhere?
Yes.
So that was true.
Yes.
All
So,
the torture techniques.
to answer your first question about the characters, Nomi is based, Nomi is made up, but her brother Z is based on an actual character whose name is Zulfikar. So, in my book, I changed things a little bit, but the first victim of the Japanese occupation was a boy, Z's age, 15 years old, who was, I won't tell you too much because I don't want to give things away. You've read it, but not everybody here may have read it, who did fire the first shot against the Japanese, and it was to save a chicken. So the chicken on the book is based on that. And that is factual. So there were, for everything that was made up, there was probably something that inspired it that actually happened. And as far as the torture is concerned, yes, I read a lot of accounts of actual prisoners who went there. I've cited my sources in the acknowledgements section, and some of them did detail some of the things that I've included. It was hard to write those parts, but I'll tell you that I actually left out a lot. What I read was far more graphic and far more difficult. And for the sake of fiction and for the sake of the beauty of the story and the ultimate, the tone of the story and the texture of the story, I ended up editing and when I revised the book, I left out some of the things. So for instance, there are comfort women on this island, and I read actual accounts. And those sections were some of the hardest sections for me to write. The Japanese, I think many people know that the Japanese, there were comfort women is something that is still denied today. And they were brought from all over Southeast Asia and East Asia, and also the women who were on the islands before the women were brought. So all of that is historical, and I found that I found pictures in the British Library archives. I found actual pictures of the women, and there was mention of them in accounts. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I found, with great respect, not exhausting. It was an exhilarating book to read.
Thank you.
I was invigorated reading it. What I found interesting in your remarks today, Uzma, is, of course, the very justified portrayal of both the Japanese and the British as being inimical to the dignity of human beings from South Asia. But do you not recall the vivid relationship between Shakuntala and an Englishman? There is a human dimension. Refreshing to discover that English are also human. So wouldn't you be fair and talk about that? How did you allow that to inject itself?
I love that question. So I mentioned to you a little while ago that, my prisoner didn't change very much, but Shakuntala is the character that changed the most. So you're very perceptive. Yes, some of the changes had to do with her relationship with the Englishman. And, one of the things that I hope I've managed to do in this book is that I have humanized the British and the Japanese, even as I have not shied away with the things that happened. Shakuntala says this thing toward the end of the book, that her only talent may be being able to see the human across politics, across ideologies, across sides. And a lot of my characters are not taking sides. A lot of them are able to sort of see the human across these poles. So I have loving, joyous relationships that they carry with them, and that actually allow them to find the human in other nationalities, in other ethnicities, and also ages and religions. So I think that is something that I hope will be apparent in the book as you read it. So, yeah.
We have time, I think, for one more question.
With you.
If you have a question, you put your hand
Yes,
up.
I have a question.
Right.
Okay, I want to ask two questions. The first is that how a nation gets born, and the second, how can be a good reader. We have just only two.
Sorry, what was the first question?
First question is that how gets a nation born, and the second, how can be a good reader.
I'm going to answer the second question first, how to be a good reader. Maybe turn off your phone when you're reading. Refuse to be distracted. Don't answer the doorbell. Just stay in the story. Let it take you somewhere else, somewhere you've never gone before. As far the first question, how a nation is born, I'm afraid I cannot answer that question in the time that we have, or maybe even if we had a lot more time, I don't think I have the expertise to answer that one. Yes.
Hi. So you were talking about your French translator saying how is it relevant in today's world. And I just spoke to you about an Urdu translation.
Yes.
So for me, I mean, you are talking about repression and resilience. And for me, this book resonated especially because of its being very relevant to us, to this country, to this area particularly. Maybe because I read it immediately after going through a very harrowing experience myself in my publishing house, going through that. So did you have that anywhere at the back of your mind when writing it? That, you know, I mean, we read about the missing people, we read about what happened in East Pakistan, and we read about, you know, our history over these past 70 plus odd years.
Yeah.
So was that anywhere at the back of your mind when writing this book? Because it stayed at the back of my mind throughout while reading it.
Yeah.
Brilliant novel, Wes.
Thank you. Yeah, very much so. I mean, it took, you know, almost 27 years to write. So for every year that I spent on it, there was something harrowing happening. I started in 1992, which was just after the 1991 Gulf War. And every year there was something. And then, you know, I grew up in Karachi during the Cold War. So, you know, you can talk about being between empires there. I mean, that's also my experience. So I do feel that, you know, the things that we experience in our immediate environment have certainly only shown me that what happened 90 years ago, 80 years ago is still very, we've never overcame these things. And so we can't really isolate the history and say it happened back then in some remote corner of the world and it doesn't really matter. I mean, we're seeing a rise of right-wing ideologies as we speak. We're seeing a rise. So, and people like NOMI are still caught in the crossfires, and the people like the prisoner are still being written out of history. So how is this over, right? It's still current.
I think one more, and then we'll done. Any more questions? Okay. Is there a mic for? Yeah.
Uzma, as a writer of fiction, how do you decide where to begin a story, and how do you know when it's time to end it?
Yes. You know, I began with the prisoner, and I began with there are letters in the book, letters that are being written to the prisoner. That's where I began. I began with these letters. I didn't know what they meant. I didn't know if they were important. I didn't know why I was writing them. I just knew that the prisoner was removed from the world, and that there were people who still loved her and remembered her who were writing to her. So that's where I began. In terms of ending, it took so long because I wasn't able to end. And sometimes I think I was almost afraid to end because I had carried her for so long that it was kind of hard to just be at peace with this finally being over. But it was NOMI who helped me to complete the book. And the prisoner and NOMI have a very special relationship in the book, and they do see each other early in the book. And then, I'll give this much away, that they meet during the book. And they help each other complete each other's stories. So NOMI is how I finished the book.
Thank you very much, Uzma. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you, Framji. You asked amazing questions, so it's a dream moderator.
Thank you, Framji, and thank you, Uzma, for invigorating session on this book of yours. There is a request from the Adab Fest organizers that audience sitting way back, they keep saying, if you can move forward if you are coming for the second session and make it a little bit more compact and less spread out. It always works better for the speakers. So we have that 5 minutes of transition. If people are settling for the next session, then they can move up. Thank you. Thank you.